morning and welcome. I'm going to talk about some really unimportant things while everyone um, floods in now that the seminar is starting. I am so pleased to welcome you all to our event today, Farm Facts and Fairy Tales. We'll be asking, are today's agriculture policies aligned with the real world? This is something that fits the core mission of our street. We are a non-profit, nonpartisan organization focused on finding pragmatic solutions to some of our stickiest problems, and certainly our relationship with the land, with policies around the land, with food, with communities. This is certainly a thorny problem that we will be unpacking today. I am a fellow with the R Street Governance Program, where I focus on agriculture policy, Pentagon spending, and federal budgets. So trying to keep more money in your wallets and increase fairness and reduce cronyism wherever it may be found. And today I'm so pleased to be joined by Sheila with Taxpayers for Common Sense, Mike Lavender with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and Stephen Conn, who is a historian with Miami University, but the one in Ohio. So it's
That's
that.
right.
You always have to say that. We'll be hearing more from Sheila and Mike very shortly. But first, I would like to introduce Stephen Conn. He's the author of a book that just came out last month. It's excellent. It's called The Lies of the Land, Seeing Rural America for What It Is and Isn't. And we'll be putting a link to that and more information about him in the chat. Stephen is the W.E. Smith Professor of History, again at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And he likes to talk about the history of the United States, how we've changed. He's talked about cities and our relationship with urbanism. And now he's looking at rural communities, or are they? Is there even such a thing? We are going to be unpacking that in the hour ahead. So, Stephen, could you set the table for our discussion, please?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. It's a real treat to be here. This is not the usual sort of group that I get to present to, so I'm very excited and just a tad nervous. You'll all be gentle. And yes, Miami University, I do have to stipulate cornfields, not Cuban food. It's the one in Ohio, though we've been around for more than 200 years, where I think Miami, the city, has only been around for about 100 years. The key takeaway from my book, I think, and thank you for mentioning it, Nan, is that the holidays are just around the corner, and everybody loves a book. So please click the link. I've got kids I've got to feed, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. What I tried to do in this book was to look at rural America from a different set of lenses than it seemed to me we were mostly using to talk about this this part of the country. And what had occurred to me was that the language we use more often than not to describe rural America, you see it in the headlines or you'll see it in the first paragraph of the story, is the word crisis or some variation thereof. When you do a historical dive on this, one of the things you discover is that the crisis, that language that we're using today was used at the turn of the 21st century. It was used in the 1980s. It was used in the 1970s. It was used in the 1880s and the 1870s, and basically every decade in between. So it seemed to me that crisis didn't really suffice if that's the word we keep using. And it occurred to me that the reason we describe rural America in crisis is because we're measuring it against a fiction. We're measuring the reality against a mythology. And in that sense, it's always going to come up short. There will always be some sense of disappointment or decline because this myth, which is woven into the DNA of our culture, from the very beginning and right up to the present day. What I discovered doing my research is that far from being left behind, which is the title of an influential book that came out with by the Princeton sociologist Robert Wuthnow, rural people have always been a part of the American mainstream. They've often been at the front of the parade, if you want to put it that way. The myth here is that we don't really want to think of rural America that way. We want to use rural spaces as a kind of blank screen onto which we project fantasies rooted in nostalgia or rooted in dissatisfactions with our own metropolitan life. So that's the big project that I was trying to do in this book. We're here to talk about the Farm Bill and farming, and there are experts here who know a lot more about all of that than me. But I thought what I would do, just for openers, is to look at 4 aspects of this rural myth that I think pertain to how we think about farming, and in turn, therefore, how we shape the legislation that then structures how we do our farming. So number 1, and let's just call this, the Jeffersonian fantasy, that what farmers are independent and self-sufficient people doing backbreaking work to wrest food out of the ground. Sure. But in fact, farming has always been supported by often vast federal programs. Let me just give 3 very broad examples of this. In order to turn what white settlers saw as wilderness into what we now see as rural, required the intervention of the U.S. military. Between 1790 and 1890, by one historian's best count, there were over 1,600 conflicts between federal troops and indigenous people. The U.S. military, in a sense, clears the space in order for us to have a rural in the first place. And you can see petitions, I use these with my students, petitions from settlers out in Nebraska or in Wyoming back to Washington saying, you need to send the federal troops out here now because we have an Indian problem that you need to take care of. So the notion that these folks, again, self-sufficient, independent, is simply not the case. Fast forward to the middle of the 19th century, and the 1862 Homestead Act amounts to, and I tell my students to think of it this way, as the largest socialist land redistribution project in American, in world history, right? So all of those pioneer farmers that we think of are doing this in the Trans-Mississippi West on land that they got for free from the federal government once the federal government cleared the space of indigenous people to start with. And then, or just to layer on top of that, especially in the Trans-Mississippi West, but not exclusively, rural space has been profoundly transformed by the Army Corps of Engineers projects of dams and irrigation. There isn't, as far as I can tell, there isn't a watershed in the United States, in the continental United States, that hasn't in some way been altered by Army Corps of Engineer projects, which means that all that water that agriculture depends on has been in some ways shaped, subsidized, otherwise brought to the farm through some kind of a federal program. So that's myth number 1, the Jeffersonian fallacy. Myth number 2, and politicians have talked about this in the past, but let me just explore it a little bit further, that somehow Main Street stands in opposition to Wall Street. That is also simply not true when you dig into the history of it. Main Street is simply has always been just a mini version of Wall Street. Farming in this country has always been, I mean, really, I think you can actually track this back to the 18th century, but certainly in the 19th century has always been driven by national, indeed international markets. So the notion that what farmers are doing is somehow, feeding themselves and producing a little bit of surplus, which they take into the town and sell to that's never been American agriculture. American agriculture, again, especially since the middle of the 19th century, has always been tied to the large commodity markets. This first and foremost out of Chicago, but not always. Likewise, farmers starting in the 19th century have always had a deep intertwined relationship to what we can call big finance. One of the things that we've discovered digging around is that the very first, in 2007, we all became familiar with this gruesome neologism, securitized mortgages. The very first examples of these are homestead farmers who want to raise more capital to buy even more land, more equipment, and especially Western banks out of San Francisco are slicing and dicing things. I mean, this is the 1860s and 70s. Farmers have always been connected to big finance in a variety of ways. When we think about the first populist uprising before populism became a kind of catch-all word, we're talking about the revolt of farmers in the Great Plains that really starts in the 1870s, accelerates in the 1880s, and culminates in the 1890s. Those farmers weren't angry at Wall Street, though they claimed that. What they really wanted was a bigger slice of Wall Street's pie. What they were really demanding was more access to credit, more access. They wanted the federal government to get off the gold standard and onto a silver standard so that there would be more money out there for them to borrow and so on and so forth. And then in the post-Second World War period in particular, one of the things I found in my research is that what a lot of so-called family farms are up to is incorporating. They start to turn themselves into limited liability corporations, and they do this for a variety of tax purposes, legal liability purposes, but mostly because it solves a set of inheritance problems when one generation of farmers dies, and how does you can't divide up the land to your 5 kids, but the corporation can continue in this way. So oddly, I mean, I set about to research the corporatization of farming, which I thought I knew what that meant. I thought it meant that large-scale corporations were buying up a lot of farmland. In fact, that didn't happen very much. What did happen were family farms turning themselves into corporations. So Main Street versus Wall Street. Main Street is simply a subsidiary of Wall Street. Number 3. I think we have in our cultural imagination that farming is pastoral, while industry is infernal. The satanic mills of Manchester, famously in the 19th century. This is also a bit of a, sleight of hand. Agriculture in this country, not, I would say, in other countries or not until recently, but since at least the Civil War, agriculture industrialized just as fast as just about every other sector of the economy. This happens first with crop production, and then it happens second with animal production. I mean, there's a reason we talk about these chicken operations that have 50,000, 75,000 chickens as factory farming, because that's really what it was. In fact, in the 1920s, the International Harvester Corporation, which sold farm equipment all over the country, was advertising was using an ad campaign where they announced every farm a factory, because the industrial model of production is what American farmers are driving to, as I said, at least from the middle of the 19th century. Fun little factoid that I'll throw out in this regard. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, it took roughly 61 hours of labor to produce an acre of wheat. By 1900, it took 3 hours to produce an acre of wheat, and that's all because of industrial technologies that arrive on farms, especially being produced by big companies like McCormick and International Harvester. When as part of the industrialization process in agriculture goes on, farming becomes more and more capital intensive. It becomes more and more resource intensive, which in turn leads to farming on a bigger and bigger scale. So if we go back to that land giveaway in 1862, what you got for your homestead claim was 160 acres. I was talking to a farmer a couple of years ago out where I live in Ohio, who said, if you want to make it as a full-time farmer, so it's not a hobby, it's not something you do over the weekend, but if you want to make it as a full-time farmer in Ohio, you need between 2,000 and 2,500 acres. So the scale of farming gets bigger. I mean, this is kind of Marxism 101, right? So the consolidation of land, the consolidation of production, and the decreased reliance on labor. The Census Department in 1910 is commenting on the exodus of young men out of rural counties all across the Great Plains because there's no need for their labor anymore. They've all been replaced by machines. We can't talk about the Farm Bill without talking about the late, great Earl Butz, a man I'm sure familiar to all of you, the architect really of the first Farm Bill back in the early 70s. And of course, Butz's bumper sticker catchphrase was "get big or get out." This is the way farm policy has been driving for at least 50 years. But really, what that Farm Bill did, what Earl Butz really reflected were trends that were going back at least a century before this. Farmers cheer, by the way. They voted for Nixon in enormous numbers. Earl Butz doesn't look great in retrospect, but certainly at the time, this is what people wanted. Okay. And myth number 4, that somehow farmers, farm communities have a deeper, almost spiritual, certainly moral connection to the land. And here I want to bring back a piece of everybody's childhood, or at least some people's childhood, and that is Little House on the Prairie. Little House on the Prairie, we all remember, was a runaway TV smash during the 1970s, based on a set of what I guess we would call now YA novels that are published in the 30s. And it drips with a kind, and if you've actually ever seen photos of the Ingalls family, they're not nearly as attractive as Michael Landon was in the TV show. What those novels and that TV program did was to sort of enshrine this nostalgic, sentimental notion of life in a farm community. The real story of the Ingalls family is that Pa Ingalls goes out there, grabs a homestead farm just outside Mankato, Minnesota, just after the federal government has fought the Sioux War in 1862, 1863, and he fails. And then he picks the family up, he goes to another, stake out another hive, fails again, he fails repeatedly. This is really the farmers have not had this, as I said, these sort of deep rootedness in the land. More often than not, and again, in my research, I see this in the 20s, I see it in the 1950s, what farmers see, they see land as simply another asset to sell if the price is right. The American historian Richard Hofstadter wrote in a famous essay of his that Americans don't love the land, they love land values. And I think that's really very true. I think it's also the case, especially in the post-Second World War period, that what you see across agricultural America is a kind of land abuse. that would certainly belie the idea that these farmers somehow cared deeply and spiritually about the soil. Chemicals, monocropping, all of that stuff. I think at some point, I could have this wrong, somebody correct me, but at some point, I think in the 1970s, somebody measured that it now required more input of energy than you were getting back in calories, right? Which is like the bass-ackwards way of doing agriculture, and probably the only agricultural system in the world operating on an energy deficit that way. But this is not about, therefore, right, as I said, a kind of moral connection as stewards of the land. I would say, just to wrap up here, that the original Farm Bill, Earl Butz's baby, incentivized and accelerated all the things that I just described. But I want to close with an email I got last week from a guy named Dave in rural western Wisconsin. He'd heard me do an interview on Wisconsin Public Radio, and he took the time to write. I'll just quote you a little bit of it. We are surrounded by industrial agriculture that exists only because of the intergenerational agro-welfare system that has been supported by the American taxpayer. The clearest way to recognize a farmer in our area is to check out mag wheels on the new 60,000 pickup truck he parks out in front of the coffee shop or bar. And I'll let Dave have the last word here on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Next, we'll hear from Sheila for a short response to that. Sheila is the senior policy analyst for our friends at Taxpayers for Common Sense. Sheila grew up on a corn, soybean, and cattle farm in northeast Nebraska, where she has seen all of these things unveil themselves in real time. And so while she covers a lot of different issues, primarily agriculture, energy, and climate policies, her kids just think that she cares about animals.
Thanks, Nan. I love where you left off, Dr. Conn, because I was actually talking with and we did a podcast at Taxpayers for Common Sense with a few farmers from Northeast Nebraska, Scott Kincaid and his son Skiles Kincaid. So some of what I'm going to talk about is referring to their story and the farming that they do in Northeast Nebraska. But Skiles, the young beginning farmer, actually made the point that after the 2012 drought, when there were huge indemnity payments coming from the federal crop insurance program, and yet there were still farm subsidy payments coming out of Washington, there was so much money in the hands of farmers that what they did was they went out and bought new trucks. They went out and built new houses and built new machine sheds. And you could see a lot of this. So I'm going to jump in a little bit, but I'll try to mention them, and you can find their podcast on our website too. I think it's great to hear from farmers directly. But thanks, Nan, for this opportunity. I have read half of your book, Dr. Conn, which was great. Look forward to getting to the rest of it. So
I'm just running a little behind because it just came out and I keep underlining.
So as Nan mentioned, I work for Taxpayers for Common Sense. I work from home in Omaha, Nebraska. And so I used to live in DC, but that's where most of my colleagues are based. And when you were talking, Dr. Conn, it reminded me also of a conversation I had with my grandfather when we were driving over the hill coming down toward our old farm place. And then my dad, where he lives now, has a new house on the other side of the road. And I remember my grandpa, shortly before he passed away, saying, I just can't believe how big this farming operation has gotten. My dad sells corn and soybean seed, and he just could not believe how big it had gotten. So I think it's interesting to put all that in perspective. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the differences in farmers that we see just within, Northeast Nebraska and here close to Omaha and Lincoln. I'm going to start with the largest farm operation that receives a very large amount of farm subsidy payments each year. I just looked it up yesterday, the day before. This farm family operation that also hires non-family employees received $1.7 million in farm subsidies in just 2020. So there were a lot higher subsidies because of the pandemic that year, but that is a staggering amount of money. And they're receiving anywhere from $250,000 to $500,000 in other years. So when you add that together, I did some math, you can buy several farms. You can come in and pay cash for farms that's 100% paid for by taxpayers, which is mind-boggling. And so then what we're seeing when I mentioned Scott and Skiles Kincaid, which are medium scale size farmers in Northeast Nebraska, what Scott, the father, has said repeatedly is that he supports or he would be supportive of farm subsidies being eliminated. And he said that he supports this because he believes, and the data actually shows from researchers, that land prices would come down significantly or at the margins if some of these farm subsidies were eliminated or reduced. And so then he sees his son, who he wants to get into farming, and sees that it would be better, and he would be more able to purchase some of that land. I know that's something you mentioned in your book too, Dr. Conn, about farm auctions and neighbors bidding against each other. So that really is something that I hear in Northeast Nebraska over and over again. But then we also have other farmers who are kind of along the lines, I'll let Mike talk more about the groups you represent and the farmers, but very diversified. They're growing fruits, vegetables, they have hogs, they have chickens and cattle, and they're on pasture. They're not in a feedlot. Those are the people that I buy my beef from and my pork from, and now we have 4 chickens in my backyard, so maybe someday I'll receive farm subsidies. But I think within these different farms, we see different stewards or different levels of these farmers being stewards of the land. I won't go into a lot of that, but I know Mike maybe talk more about that. But this idea that farms must get big or get out, from our perspective, we're wondering, why are taxpayers subsidizing that farm consolidation? So that's a big question. And then I like the other point you made in your book, Dr. Conn, about subsidies never going away. I think you made that point when you were talking about the 1970s. And I think whether we see record farm income or really low farm income, we're still seeing subsidies go out the door from USDA year after year, regardless of whether or not farmers actually need them or not. And we're also seeing subsidies go to millionaires and billionaires and people that aren't even farmers. They just might happen to own land. So Nan, to get to the conclusion and to the answer of the question that you put in the title of the panel for today, I think that no, today's ag policies are not aligned with the real world, because the federal crop insurance program, the Commodity Credit Corporation are programs that are allowing huge amounts of farm subsidies to be shoveled out of Washington, D.C. And those programs were created in the 1930s. So there's a big disconnect there. Nan, you point this out in your great paper. I think that's in the chat. And the final thing I'll say is that in Washington, we're hearing certain farm subsidy proponents and farm lobbyists asking for more farm subsidies, but that is not what I'm hearing from farmers out here in Nebraska. Thanks, Nan.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I see we're getting some questions in some different areas, and we will get to those. But first, I'm so pleased to introduce Mike Lavender, who leads the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition's overall policy strategy as the policy director and their advocacy efforts. Mike has been in the game a long time. Like Sheila and I, he is a hollowed out husk of a person. We'll be lucky if we survive this farm bill cycle at this rate. But Mike represents a lot of really, as Sheila mentioned, diverse types of farms and how they are intersecting with their environments and caring for that as they also intersect with the federal government. Please take it away, Mike.
Thanks so much, Nan, and thanks also to Sheila and Dr. Conn for joining the panel. It's really great to hear all the comments, and I'm excited to be here and to contribute. I hadn't planned to start with this, but I can't help myself. But and Dr. Conn, I also have started working my way through your book, and this may be in there at some point. But as Sheila, as you and Dr. Conn were speaking, I was reminded of a recent trip that I took to down to USDA. I'm based here in Washington D.C., and a recent trip I took to USDA to see the unveiling, which is done on a monthly basis, of the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates Report, right? So it's this big report that USDA puts out. It collates information on essentially supply and use in the US and the world of wheat, rice, coarse grains, oilseeds, cottons, and on down the line. Security around the release of the report on a monthly basis is so tight because the figures, right, both U.S. domestic production and world production, the figures can trigger market reactions that amount in billions of dollars worldwide and within a matter of seconds. So I think as we head into this conversation and thinking about NSAC's role, right, the work that Dr. Conn has done, and I know so many of us have talked about for years, is shedding a light on not only what is rural, but what is agriculture in the United States. And it's not important because it diminishes or props up one form of agriculture over the other, but really shining a light on what is agriculture, plain and simple, in this country at this point, and how do we need to think about changing policy, supporting policy, pushing back against policy to get a type of food and farm system in this country that is actually supporting all farmers, right? That is actually supporting everyone in this country with healthy diets. So if you ever have the chance to make your way down to USDA, it's open to the public. If you can wrangle a ticket to see the release of that monthly report, I'd encourage you to do so. So with that having been said, my name is Mike Lavender. As Nan said, I'm the policy director at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. NSAC is over 30 years old now. I think we're right on the cusp of our 30th anniversary. NSAC is a grassroots alliance of over 150 members nationwide, with a presence in nearly all 50 states. Our members are the farm, food, conservation, and rural organizations that work with and support small and mid-sized farmers and ranchers, right? So the folks within NSAC's membership tend to think about conservation practices. They tend to think about the environment. They tend to think about their local and regional community and how they're interacting within that, and in so many other ways. And our members are truly on the front lines of Farm Bill policy, right? We've heard the Farm Bill talked about a number of times already today. I think in preparing for this conversation, I think one of the things that stuck out to me, and even just hearing Dr. Conn kind of give the overview of the new book, one of the reasons this is so important, and having the arc of history all the way to where we are now, one of the reasons it's so important is because where we stand today on November 14th, 2023, we have accumulated in very real terms, in terms of federal policy, the long history of everything that he described. So the federal policy that we have today that supports farmers and ranchers and our food and farm system is the product of all of that experience. And disproportionately, it benefits and skews to support a model of industrial agriculture that does not support diversification, that does not support climate resilience, that is not responsible in terms of, that is often not responsible in terms of fiscal savings. And so there are very real consequences in this moment today of the past experiences of American agriculture. And I wanted to offer, on the eve or in the midst of the current Farm Bill reauthorization, offer a couple of tangible connections to this Farm Bill reauthorization. And the major fault lines of the 2023, or maybe we should start saying 2024 Farm Bill reauthorization, fall along several different lines. One is there's been a clear ask, both publicly and privately, for investment and increased investment in Title I of the Farm Bill, and to a lesser degree, Title 11. And those are the commodity and crop insurance components of the Farm Bill. Increased investment in those, and I'll talk about those a bit more in just a second. There's also been a large push from a number of us, NSAC included, to protect some of the investments in conservation practices that can help farmers be more resilient to increasing extreme weather and climate-related impacts through the Inflation Reduction Act. So protecting investments that are incredibly popular amongst all farmers, protecting those investments and keeping them where they are, keeping them focused on climate and keeping them in agricultural conservation programs. And then the third key dynamic within this Farm Bill, as it is for nearly every Farm Bill, is nutrition assistance and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. I won't focus on that as much today, but really want to focus on Title I commodity programs and Title 11 crop insurance to illustrate a point. According to work that NSAC and others have done, crop insurance, which is often named as one of the most surefire ways to support farmers and ranchers by policymakers writ large. In fact, 80% of farmers in the United States are not enrolled in crop insurance. Yet crop insurance is often upheld as if lawmakers support crop insurance, then they're supporting farmers and they're supporting the farming way of life. Similarly, proposals in this current Farm Bill reauthorization to increase investment in Title I commodity programs, and specifically programs known as PLC, price loss coverage, as well as the ARC program, proposed increases in investment in this upcoming Farm Bill to those programs have been estimated to support roughly 0.3%, 0.3% of farmers. So we're talking about a couple of the biggest programs and components of the Farm Bill, but really the farmers that are involved in those programs and that would benefit from increased investment in those is vanishingly small. And so at NSAC, as I talked a little bit about earlier, many of our members, not all, but many of our members are the members who aren't necessarily actively being supported by some of the farm policy that we've accrued over the years and that we have today. So at NSAC, heading into this Farm Bill and in the midst of this Farm Bill, our approach has been, what are the responsible, meaningful reforms, Sheila touched on these briefly, that we can look to in terms of our farm safety net and the crop insurance program and the commodity programs? Where can we accrue meaningful savings while also still having good policy that supports farmers? We think there are opportunities to do that, and there are a number of proposals out there. But also, how are we thinking about expanding access through federal policy and making sure that there is a level playing field, an equitable playing field for not only small and mid-sized farmers, for not only diversified farmers, but for young and beginning farmers, for farmers who have been historically underserved and in some cases currently underserved by USDA, namely Black, Indigenous, and people of color farmers. So there's a long way to go, both in this Farm Bill and subsequent farm bills, to right-size our federal policy to making sure that we're supporting the diversity of American agriculture and the future of American agriculture in a variety of different ways outside of the in-the-box thinking of Titles I and Title 11. And I should say, as NSAC, we recognize the need for a farm safety net to support farmers and ranchers when the chips are down or they're experiencing extreme weather events and they need support. We do support a farm safety net, but we need to think of a farm safety net as more than just a program or two or a title or two, right? The way to think about a farm safety net is to think about the diversity of investments that we make throughout the Farm Bill, whether that be in research, in credit, access to credit, and a whole host of other options. So I think with that, Nan, I will leave it there, and I'm sure we have questions, and I know you have a Q&A lined up, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm gonna start with 2 questions, and then we'll get to the Q&A. I have like dozens now, but we don't have time for that today. And I also want to thank you, Mike, for bringing up the traditionally underserved populations at USDA, because that's a point that Stephen makes in his book as well about how we've kind of erased the role of Black, Indigenous, other persons of color in the story that lots of people tell themselves about rural America. And now we can check that box. We don't unless someone wants to discuss that more, but I'm really glad that you brought up that point. It's a very important one. But also what I thought you said, Mike, about how we have this idea that we have the Farm Bill and these robust, very expensive safety net programs, and they're there to help farmers, but we're only touching the biggest of the big farmers. So we're talking about myths on myths here. We have a myth that we tell ourselves, not just about rural culture and farmers and, the guy waking up with the rooster every day, and that's who our dollars are supporting. Well, one, that is somehow very special and important, but then we also are telling ourselves this other myth about that's how we're supporting and engaging with that. So I think it's very interesting that we're just, we have this sandwich of myths, and then we think that somehow, our policies are sustainable or workable when they aren't built on facts in this case. But I was hoping Sheila, Mike, and Stephen, if you wanted to respond as well, are there other myths that you see in your work on farm policy, and how do those myths and the myths that Stephen talked about, how do they intersect with your work? Where are there challenges and things like that? What is the role in federal policy?
So let me take a first swing at that, Nan, because that's a very big question. I'll preface it just to kind of underscore what Mike said a moment ago. Last time I checked the EWG website and looked at the major recipients of farm subsidies in my county in Ohio, 3 out of the top 5 of them all had the same last name as the governor. The small government champion, Mike DeWine, his family has been getting rich off farm subsidies ever since the beginning of farm subsidies. So there we are, right? That sort of underscores who's actually benefiting from this. So the way I'm thinking about your question, and is to wonder, it's probably a chicken and egg problem, but does the Farm Bill and the way it gets structured reflect a set of attitudes that the people involved in it already have, a set of cultural beliefs and whatnot, or does it in turn shape those cultural beliefs? I'm gonna, as we've already described, I'm gonna guess that when the Farm Bill, really comes to a boil next year, we're gonna hear lots about saving the family farm, because that does seem to just resonate with both politicians and the people who elect them. Though, in fact, as we also all know, that's not really what the Farm Bill is all about. So there is something, as I said, sort of woven into the DNA of our national identity that we're a nation of small farmers and they're struggling and we need to help them. And that's really not what the Farm Bill is all about, and it never really has been what the Farm Bill is all about. I'll throw this out. I didn't try this out in the book. Maybe I should have. In some ways, the Farm Bill, as it was originally created in the early 1970s, is a product of the Cold War, and it reflects the Cold War in all kinds of ways. And that Cold War has allegedly been over for 30 years, and yet we haven't really rethought the foundations and assumptions on which all of that policy got built.
Sheila or Mike?
I'd just add briefly that I think we hear a lot of talk about supporting the next generation of agriculture Washington, D.C. are supporting beginning farmers. And I think there's some really easy policy solutions we can make to further that. But when we have the federal crop insurance program, for instance, which has become one of the most expensive taxpayer programs in the Farm Bill, it provides unlimited subsidies. So literally there are no limits. So I think that gets to one of the questions in the chat as well. And there's a lot of Government Accountability Office reports on this. So when one farmer is receiving unlimited subsidies and another beginning farmer is trying to get started, you just don't see those beginning farmer names in these databases of farm subsidy recipients yet. Right. And you know, you look at the age of an average farmer, which I see too, right at retirement age, most of them are. So there's a huge opportunity here, but that's not, I don't think, what we're seeing from policy solutions being proposed in Washington right now.
Mike, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I would briefly add, you know, to touch on a couple of points that I made a few minutes ago. You know, the current environment that we have in the U.S. food and farm system, where there's, you know, incredibly high levels of consolidation in some components of the food and farm system. There's incredibly expensive or high land values, incredibly difficult to access land for all types of farmers, particularly and including those who are young and beginning and want to get into farming to help address some of those concerns. All of this is a consequence of the policy that we've had in place. And although the names of the programs have changed and some of the specifics have changed, the arc that we've been on, you know, as Dr. Conn and Sheila have mentioned, is more or less been the same over the past number of decades, again, with some of the specifics change. So I think the myth here is that somehow continuing that, even under a different name, or continuing to invest in the same policies, or that there's one silver bullet to address, you know, the ills or the issues that we see out there. And that's where I really get to the point of thinking about the farm safety net. It is a diversity of things that we need to invest in and make sure are right on our policy levers. And it's not a single program or a single title within the Farm Bill. Thinking about access to credit, thinking about making sure that organizations, farms of all different sizes and shapes are able to access and work with USDA on the types of work that they want to do in their communities, whether it's urban or rural. There needs to be an expansion of kind of how we think about supporting agriculture more than just the traditional status quo, because the traditional status quo has gotten us to where we are today.
I'll just throw in, last time I checked, I believe there was only one state in the country where the average age of a farmer was going down, and it was in Maine. And I think that's largely because everybody else left the state and gave up farming anyway. So, you know, a bunch of 20-somethings have gone up there to try to make a go of it in the farm. I want to add one other variable to this equation, because I talked about the way in which farming and the federal government have always been tethered, going back to the very beginning of the nation. I think it's important also, and I didn't write about this, I probably should have, to think about an intermediary level of government, and that's the state universities, the ag campuses. I taught at Ohio State for the better part of 20 years, and I think that the regular contact that farmers have had over the decades with extension agents from the land grant university in farming states has also contributed in a whole host of ways to creating the system that we have now, which, as I think, Mike, you pointed out, is broken at all sorts of points. And if we want to fix it, it may also mean going to the ag campuses and working with people at the state universities, because that's often the point of contact that farmers have with big questions of policy.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question, and we'll try to keep our responses short so that we can get to the other question that someone raised in the chat. And that is that one of the things that the book covers a lot is that there's really no such thing as rural. And I won't go into all of that. You need to read the book for that. But this interesting idea, because we have this concept that each of us develop about rural, but then when you dig into it, you realize, this is not a monolith. This is actually like a really varied, very regionally differentiated idea. Yet we have these kind of one size fits all policies. Sheila and Mike, can you speak a little to the role of these regions that are actually so different in the Farm Bill debate and development?
I would just say it was actually one thing that was mentioned in your book, Dr. Conn, about rice subsidies. And I recently looked at the map of rice production, cotton production, peanut production, which are a lot of the commodities that could potentially benefit significantly from reference price increases that we're hearing in Washington, D.C. right now in the Farm Bill debate. Those crops are grown in very limited portions of the United States, whereas corn and soybeans are grown in a much larger swath of the U.S., but yet we're seeing very narrow policy prescriptions. I think you've heard that from some of the panelists, but I think we really need to look at that as a whole, see who's benefiting it and why, and what's the real need, or is there a lack of need for those subsidies?
Yeah, just to add briefly, I think the regional diversification of agriculture, right, is based on history to some degree, but based on climate variability in different parts of the country and just what can successfully grow. And there are some things that have slightly shifted that in terms of different types of agriculture. But I think the one and the regional variability impacts the Farm Bill in so many different ways, and in some ways drives bipartisanship in farm bills, which makes the Farm Bill a unique beast in this particular day and age, which we think is a good thing. And we think bipartisanship is essential. I think one thing that is going to impact every region, and I'm reminded that the fifth National Climate Assessment, I believe, was released earlier this morning. We continue to see that the impacts of climate, whether that be droughts or floods or anywhere in between, early freezes, are impacting farmers in a variety of different ways. And so if we're looking for common themes across what can be regional variability, investing in the resilience of farmers, big, small, anywhere in between, livestock, otherwise, that needs to be one of the bottom lines. And if we're not doing that, we're not investing in the livelihoods of these farmers. We're not investing, in their sustainability ultimately. And so that comes back to protecting, investment that Congress made through the Inflation Reduction Act and upwards of $20 billion in agricultural conservation programs specifically targeted to help farmers be resilient. And one of the things we know about that money is that it's incredibly popular among farmers. The programs that farmers look to for conservation support are turning away upwards of 75% of farmers in a given year. So there's tremendous demand. And we know some of the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act are so popular already among farmers that there isn't enough money to meet demand. So as we head into this Farm Bill and think about regional diversification, we have to be thinking about climate impacts, and we have to be thinking about how are we protecting resources that help farmers be resilient and prosperous in the future.
We have kind of maybe a complicated question in the Q&A tab. How do we reconcile the need to draw back farm subsidy payments with the understanding that agriculture, due to increased input and labor costs, as we've mentioned, is a get big or get out game? How do we plan to feed 9.5 billion people by 2050 if we shrink the scale of our world-renowned and highly sustainable farms?
So I have no business trying to answer a question like that. I'm the history guy. People I deal with are all dead. So I would say, though, I would take small issue with the end of the question. It isn't a sustainable system that we have right now. It's not sustainable in terms of carbon, and it's not sustainable in terms of water. When you were, Sheila, looking at rice, sort of the map of rice production, the fact that rice is being grown in Southern California is absurd from a climatological point of view. So I'll stop there. I would, as I said, I would just take issue with that.
Just based on what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it really showed people or made people think about where their food is coming from. And I know one of the farms 45 minutes away from Omaha here, they were able to innovate and shift their business plan in real time and still make money. They didn't make more money right away, but by the time like a year had passed, they actually did about the same level of sales or even a little bit better. And they were operating with really no government subsidies at all, and they were feeding people. Whereas a lot of the corn production and soybean production today, cotton or other crops, go into biofuels, go into things that are not food.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We also, and to plug my paper, which I really love too, I talk about this a little bit in the Shaky Foundations of Modern Farm Policy, which I linked to in the top of the chat, but also in a forthcoming, shorter, more narrative-driven paper that really looks at how innovative farms can be and some of just the amazing technology that people are currently using or that will come online soon. And I think farmers in many cases are doing more with less. There are, significant labor costs, and there are significant input costs. So they're doing more without those. We have all kinds of labor saving devices and machines and ways to grow things, and we can be more smart about how we are applying nutrients and pesticides, and we're just becoming more and more creative about that, and it's benefiting the environment and our stomachs with bigger, yummier yields. Mike, did you want to add anything to that? If not, Vinny, sorry, we are not going to get to your question. There's so many other things that we could be digging into, but I just want to emphasize as we close that this myth of rural Americans and farms and the so-called small family farms, which exist, but there's also really giant family farms, plays a really significant role in our federal policies, and we need to be honest and re-examine that, I think, as we go about dispensing other people's dollars, so that we can stay on time. I have just one last very short question. Tina Fey's character Liz Lemon in 30 Rock says that no part of America is more American than any other part. I believe that all anyone really wants in life is to sit in peace and eat a sandwich. We spend a lot of time as a country thinking of certain people as real Americans and more real than other people. And so I would just ask each of you very briefly to tell me, what do you think defines a real American? What do we all really want?
My family and I lived in Warsaw, Poland for 6 months about 10 years ago. And my son was maybe 11. And he was really droopy one day. And I asked him what was going on. And he said he was really homesick. And I said, well, what are you homesick for? He said, well, I really just want to hear people speak English. And I really miss Mexican food. So for me, being homesick for Mexican food is what it means to be an American.
Excellent. I agree. Sheila, Mike?
I also lived in the UK for a while, so share some of that. But actually, when you sent the title of the panel along, Nan, I was reminded of one time someone called me a city girl, and I took that to heart because I consider myself a farm girl at heart. But for what it means to be an American, I think whether it's a farm girl or a city girl, we're all Americans and we can all find common ground.
Thank you.
As someone who's heading to lunch right after this, that line about the sandwich really got me where it counts, and I think there's a reasonable degree of truth to that. You know, I think similar to Sheila, I think you know, it spans so many different boundaries that you would traditionally think of, including citizenship. But I think it's really the ability to and the desire to have difficult conversations, oftentimes across party lines that challenge your own assumptions, and ultimately can hopefully yield a better place on policy or wherever we may go. So I would leave it with that and a good sandwich as well.
I'll conclude by saying I think we all want a level playing field, and that's what a lot of the work that Sheila, Mike, and I do when it comes to the Farm Bill. We think everyone deserves a fair shake to pursue their desires and their dreams, but also I think, and this intersects with a myth, and I think someday anthropologists will have a lot to say about this. We all want 3 chickens in our backyard, wherever we live. So thank you all again for joining us. Addison posted the link to where you can find the recording of the Zoom, but we will also follow up with an email to all attendees with the link, as well as other resources, including where you can get Dr. Conn's book, where you can read our papers, where you can learn more about the excellent work that Sheila and Mike's organizations do as well. So thank you again for joining us for this very important conversation, and we will stay in touch. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.